He didn't even look at her face when he said it. Douglas Brandt leaned back in his chair at the general store, loud enough for the whole room to hear, and said, "We don't take in strays here. Not animals. Not women like her." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel on purpose. That was almost worse. It was casual. Like dismissing a person was something they did before lunch. Clara Whitmore stood 12 feet away, holding a suitcase that had one broken latch and boots that had separated at the left sole. She had walked 11 days to get to this town. 11 days. She heard every word. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She picked up that suitcase, pressed the broken latch shut with her thumb, and walked toward the one gate nobody in Cedar Hollow expected her to reach. If that were you, a stranger in a town that had already decided who you were before you opened your mouth, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things with nothing but their own hands and their own will, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we bring you stories like this one, and you don't want to miss a single chapter. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that gate. The morning Clara Whitmore arrived at Cedar Hollow Ranch, the sky was the color of old dishwater, and the wind smelled like something that had already given up. She had been walking since before sunrise. Her left boot made a wet slapping sound with every step because the sole had finally given out somewhere around the 3rd mile past the last town, a town called Ridgecrest, whose sheriff had told her, politely but firmly, that they had no work for her and no room at the boarding house, and maybe she ought to try the next county over. That had been the 4th town, 4 towns in 11 days, and not one person had looked past the mud on her coat or the shadows under her eyes long enough to ask what she could actually do. Clara was 34 years old. She had spent the last 6 years managing a household, keeping accounts, tending a kitchen garden that fed 7 people through 2 hard winters, and nursing a dying woman, her employer, not a relative, through the last 14 months of her life. When that woman died, her son had inherited the property, thanked Clara with a handshake and 2 weeks' pay, and hired someone younger. She hadn't even been given time to grieve. She'd picked up her suitcase, the same one her mother had carried to a new city 30 years before, and she had started walking because there was nowhere to sit down and no one to sit down with. Cedar Hollow wasn't on any map she'd found. She'd heard the name from a dry goods clerk in Ridgecrest who'd mentioned it the way people mention places they don't think much about, sideways, almost by accident, while counting change. "There's a ranch out that way, Carter Place. Struggling, I hear. Man's got 2 kids and no wife, and the whole thing's gonna seed." That was enough for Clara. She didn't go because she had a plan. She went because it was a direction. The gate at Cedar Hollow was iron, which surprised her. Most struggling ranches had wooden gates that leaned or had already been replaced by a length of rope. This one was iron, old and dark with rust at the hinges, but it was still standing. Someone had cared enough once to put up iron. She stood in front of it for a moment, breathing. Her left foot was wet inside the boot. Her back ached in a specific place just below the right shoulder blade where the suitcase strap had been cutting all day. She was hungry in the flat, empty way that stops feeling like hunger and just becomes a kind of gray fog behind your eyes. She pushed open the gate. The yard was not what she expected. She had prepared herself for pure neglect. Trash blown into corners, broken equipment rotting in the open, the kind of disorder that comes from a person who has stopped caring entirely. But Cedar Hollow wasn't that. It was more precise than that. It was the disorder of someone who cared desperately but was being crushed by too many problems at once. There were tools leaned against the fence in a specific order, like they'd been placed there with intention and then never picked up again. A child's boot sat alone on the porch step. Just one, the left one. A shutter on the front window was hanging by a single nail, swinging very slowly, and someone had propped a wooden beam under it at an angle to keep it from falling further. That beam had been there long enough to have weathered gray. The front door opened before she reached the porch. The man who came out was not what she'd expected either. She had built a picture in her mind from that one sentence, struggling man, 2 kids, going to seed. And she'd imagined someone defeated, slumped shoulders, a beard that had lost its shape, eyes that stayed somewhere else while talking to you. Nathan Carter was none of that. He was lean in the way people go lean when they've been working too hard for too long without enough food. His jaw was sharp, and his eyes were fully present, and that presence wasn't warmth. It was wariness, precise and old. He looked like a man who had learned to see trouble coming and then discovered it didn't help any. He stopped on the porch and looked at her. She noticed he looked at her face first. Not her coat, not her suitcase, not her broken boot. Her face. She filed that away. "I'm not buying anything," he said. "I'm not selling anything." He tilted his head. "Then what are you doing on my property?" Clara set down her suitcase. Not to rest. She was past the point where setting it down made a difference. But because she'd learned over 11 days that people took you more seriously when you weren't holding something, like you had more hands free, more options. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I've been walking 11 days. I've been turned away from 4 towns. She said it plain, no performance in it. "I'm not here to beg. I'm here to offer a trade." Something shifted in his expression, but not toward softness. More like he was recalibrating, adjusting for something he hadn't expected. "What kind of trade?" "I can cook, clean, mend, keep accounts, manage a kitchen garden, and I'm good with children. I'll do all of it, every day, whatever you need." She kept her eyes steady on his. "I don't want money. I want a roof and food until I figure out the next step." Nathan Carter was quiet for a long time. The shutter swung. The wind moved through the yard and lifted a little dust near the fence line. "I've had 3 women come through here in the last 2 years, he finally said. "One left after 4 days, one lasted 6 weeks and walked off while the kids were still asleep. The third one?" He stopped. "It doesn't matter." "What happened to the third one doesn't matter to me either," Clara said. "I'm not them." "You all say that." "I expect we do." She glanced at the house. "Are your children inside?" His jaw tightened. "Why?" "Because one of them left a boot on the porch step, the left one, which means either they lost the right one, or they left in a hurry, or they've been wearing mismatched shoes for long enough that nobody noticed anymore." She looked back at him. "Any of those things would matter to me if I were staying here." Nathan Carter looked at her for another long beat. Then he looked at the boot. He hadn't noticed the boot. It wasn't that he was a bad father. That was the thing about grief that people outside of it didn't understand. It didn't make you cold, it made you blind. Not to everything, just to the small specific things. The single boot, the shutter hanging wrong, the way a child had stopped talking much at dinner. He looked back at Clara. "You can come in," he said. "I'm not promising anything. I'm not asking you to." She picked up her suitcase, pressed the broken latch shut again with her thumb, and walked up the porch steps. The child's boot was on the second step. She picked it up without breaking stride and carried it inside with her. Nathan watched her do it and didn't say a word. The inside of the house smelled like old smoke and something that might have been soup days ago. The kitchen table had 3 chairs, one of which had a cracked leg held together with what looked like wire and stubbornness. The floor was clean, swept, genuinely swept, which surprised her. And then she noticed the broom leaning in the corner with its bristles worn down nearly to nothing, and understood that someone in this house was trying. Just trying with the wrong tools. A girl appeared in the doorway to the back hall. She might have been 8 or 9. It was hard to tell because she had the particular stillness of a child who had learned to take up as little space as possible. Her hair was pulled back in a braid that had been done several days ago and was now more memory than braid. She looked at Clara with eyes that were cautious but not afraid, which told Clara something about what kind of fear this girl had learned. Not the acute fear of danger, the chronic fear of disappointment. "This is Lily," Nathan said from behind Clara. Lily didn't say anything. She was looking at the boot in Clara's hand. Clara looked down at it too. "Is this yours?" A small nod. "I found it on the porch step. Do you know where the other one is?" Lily pointed silently toward the back of the house. "Would you show me?" Something moved across the girl's face. Not excitement, not yet, but a kind of cautious alertness, the way a stray animal looks when someone speaks to it gently for the first time in a while. She turned and walked down the hall. Clara followed without checking whether Nathan was still there. He was. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched his daughter lead a stranger toward the back of the house. and for the first time in a long time, he felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't hope. It was too fragile to be called hope. It was the thing that comes just before hope, when you're not sure yet if you're allowed. The other boot was under the bed in what turned out to be Lily's room. Small, with a single window and a quilt that had been carefully folded at the foot of the bed. Carefully folded, but the fold wasn't straight. It had been done by child's hands that were trying to do it right. Clara picked up the boot and sat down on the edge of the bed without being invited to. She turned both boots over in her hands, checked the soles, checked the laces. "They're a little tight," she said, "but they'll last another season if you keep them dry." She held them out to Lily. "Don't leave them outside. The leather'll go stiff." Lily took the boots. She sat down on the floor and started putting them on. Clara watched her do it, the careful way she threaded the laces, the slight frown of concentration. "What's your name?" Lily asked, without looking up. "Clara." "Are you staying?" Clara hesitated for exactly 1 second. "I'm going to try." Lily finished tying the second boot. She looked up, and for the first time since Clara had walked in the door, the girl's face opened slightly, like a window cracked just enough to let in air. "James didn't come out," she said. "He doesn't come out when strangers are here. He used to, but he stopped." "How long ago did he stop?" Lily thought about it. "After the last lady left?" She said it without drama, just as a fact she had organized herself around. Clara felt something harden in her chest, not toward Nathan, not exactly, but toward the specific cruelty of a situation that could do that to a child. Turn a small, open boy into one who hid from strangers, not from one bad thing, but from a pattern, from the reliable arrival and departure of people who had seemed like they might stay. She stood up. "Do you think he'd come out if you asked him?" Lily considered this seriously. "Maybe, if I told him you found my boot." That was the first time Clara almost smiled since she'd walked through the gate. She kept it small, kept it contained. "Then maybe you should tell him." Lily went. And Clara stood in the small bedroom with the carefully, not quite straight quilt and the window that let in the gray afternoon light, and breathed for a moment. She had made no promises she couldn't keep. She had asked for nothing she didn't earn. She had no idea yet what this place was going to cost her, but she had felt something when she picked up that boot from the porch step, something she hadn't felt in 11 days of walking and 4 towns of rejection. Not safety. She was too experienced to confuse someone opening a door for safety. She had felt the specific sensation of being somewhere she might actually be useful. That was enough. For now, it was enough. James turned out to be 6, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway 11 minutes later holding his sister's hand and wearing 1 sock and 1 bare foot, looking at Clara with the kind of careful intensity that only very small people and very old animals have. He didn't speak for a long time. Clara was at the kitchen counter by then, having quietly assessed what was in the cupboards without opening anything she hadn't been invited to open. She sensed him, didn't turn around immediately. When she finally turned, she kept her face ordinary, not performing warmth, not dialing up a brightness she didn't feel, just her face, the way it was. "You're James," he nodded. "I'm Clara. I'm going to be staying here for a while if that's all right with you." He blinked. Nobody had asked him that. You could see it on his face, the slight recalibration. "Are you going to leave?" he asked. It was a terrible question to be asked by a 6-year-old. Terrible in its simplicity. Terrible in the fact that he'd had to learn to ask it. "I'm going to stay as long as I'm needed," Claire said, "and I'm going to tell you when that changes. Before it changes." James looked at his sister. Lily shrugged, which seemed to be their language for, "I think it's okay." He looked back at Clara. "Okay," he said, and he went and sat at the kitchen table, the one with the cracked leg, and watched her with enormous serious eyes while she started to figure out what she could make for dinner from what was in the cupboards. Nathan stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall and watched all 3 of them. He should have felt something clear, relief or suspicion, or the instinct to send her away before his children got attached to another person who might leave. Instead, he felt the thing he'd been feeling for 2 years without a name for it, the exhaustion of being the only wall standing between his children and a world that didn't slow down for grief. He didn't know yet what Clara Whitmore actually was. He didn't know about the irrigation map she would find, or the legal fight that was coming, or the night she would stand in front of an entire town and refuse to be destroyed. He just knew that his daughter had led her to find a boot, and his son had come out of hiding, and whatever that meant, whatever it was worth, it was more than had happened in this house in a very long time. He stepped back into the hall before Clara could see him standing there. He told himself it was because he had work to do. He was not ready to examine what it actually was. The first week at Cedar Hollow nearly broke her. Not the work. Clara had never been afraid of work. It was the specific texture of that house that wore on her. The way grief had settled into everything like dust settles into wood grain, invisible until you run your hand across it and your fingers come back gray. The way Nathan moved through rooms like he was navigating a space he'd memorized but no longer recognized. The way Lily set the table every evening with 4 plates before catching herself and putting the 4th one back, every single night, as if her hands hadn't learned yet what her mind already knew. Clara didn't say anything about the 4th plate. Not yet. She started with the things that had immediate, practical answers because those were the things she could actually fix. The broom with the worn-down bristles got replaced on the 3rd day. She found an old one in the barn with a broken handle, cut it down with a saw she located hanging on a nail behind the grain barrels, and fitted a new grip from a length of dowel she'd discovered in a box under the workbench. Nathan came in from the east field and saw her sweeping with it and stopped in the doorway. Where did that come from? The barn. He looked at it. That handle's been broken for 2 years. It's not broken anymore. He didn't say thank you. He turned and went back outside. Clara kept sweeping and told herself that was fine because she hadn't done it for the thank you. The cracked chair leg in the kitchen came next. She used wire she found on a shelf, a method she'd seen once done with furniture twice as damaged, wrapping it in a pattern that distributed the pressure differently so the cracks stopped trying to spread. She tested it by sitting on it herself, which was how Nathan found her, sitting on the repaired chair at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning, reading his water ledger, the one he kept in a cracked leather binder on the shelf above the door. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, and this time the look on his face had an edge to it. That's mine. I know. She didn't close it. Your water figures from the last 2 years don't match the output from the lower pasture. The channel should be carrying more than this. She turned the ledger so he could see the page she was on. Did you know there was a drop in pressure starting about 18 months ago? I know everything that's wrong with this ranch, he said, and his voice had gone flat in the particular way that meant she'd stepped somewhere she wasn't supposed to. Clara closed the ledger, put it back on the shelf, not by handing it to him, just by reaching up and replacing it in its exact spot. I wasn't trying to get into your business. What were you trying to do? She thought about it. Understand what I'm working with. He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd already made. She'd been up since 5, and he stood at the counter drinking it with his back half turned to her. There was a silence that lasted long enough to have its own weight. The channel's blocked, he said finally, or broken. I had 2 men look at it. Both said it wasn't worth fixing, said the source had probably dried up anyway. What do you think? He turned slightly. What? What do you think? Not what the men said. What do you think? Another silence. This one different. More reluctant than heavy. I think it doesn't make sense, he said slowly. Because the land on the upper slope is still wet. Ground's damp up there even in dry seasons. The water's going somewhere. It's just not coming to where it needs to be. Clara looked at him. That's not a broken channel. That's a blockage. He looked back at her. It's different, she said. A broken channel, the water disperses. A blockage, the water's still moving, just not where you want it. She paused. Do you have the original survey maps? The ones from when the channel was first built? Why would I have those? Ranches like this usually do. Filed with the property deed, sometimes with the county, sometimes in a box in the attic that nobody's looked at in 30 years. Nathan stared at her for a long beat. Who are you? It wasn't hostile. It was puzzled. Genuinely puzzled. Like he was revising something he thought he'd already categorized. I told you who I am, Clara said. He looked at his coffee. I'll look for the maps, he said. Maybe. That was the closest thing to progress she got from Nathan in the first week. The children were different. Children, in Clara's experience, made decisions faster than adults because they hadn't yet accumulated enough disappointment to make them slow. Lily had made her decision somewhere around the second day, evidenced by the fact that she began appearing in the kitchen in the mornings before Nathan came down, sitting at the table and watching Clara work with the careful attention of someone who wanted to learn but hadn't yet decided to ask. Clara didn't push her. She just narrated, not in a performed teaching voice way, just out loud, matter-of-factly. The bread needs the dough worked about 10 minutes. You'll know it's ready when it stops sticking to your hands. Or, if you're going to cut onions, run cold water on your wrists first. I don't know why it helps, but it does. On the third day, Lily got up from her chair and stood next to Clara at the counter. She didn't ask to help. She just stood there. Clara handed her the bowl. That was the beginning. James was slower, which Clara understood. He was 6, and the world had taught him very specifically that people who seemed like they were staying often turned out not to be. So he watched from a distance for several days, hovering at doorways, following at lengths of 10 or 15 feet, appearing around corners. Clara let him. She didn't try to draw him in or make special effort to include him. She just made sure that whatever she was doing was visible and unhurried. On the 5th day, he appeared at her elbow while she was in the yard checking the kitchen garden. A sad rectangle of ground that had been roughly started and then abandoned, with 3 surviving tomato plants that had gone leggy from neglect and a row of something that might have been carrots. Those are bad, James said, pointing at the tomatoes. They've been better, Claire agreed, but they're not dead. Dad said they're dead. They're not dead. They're just unhappy. She crouched down to the level of the plants and pinched off one of the yellow lower leaves. See how the stem's still green? Dead plants don't have green stems. James crouched next to her. He looked at the stem for a long time. What do we do? Stake them so they can stand upright. Give them some water that isn't from the top, from around the roots, and wait. What if they die anyway? Then we'll know we tried. He thought about that. Then he said, Can I help stake them? I was hoping you'd ask. She handed him a stick and a length of twine she'd cut beforehand, and they spent an hour in the kitchen garden together. James concentrating hard on tying the twine the way she showed him, his small face set with the gravity of someone doing something important for the first time. When Nathan came around the side of the house and saw them, he stopped. He stood there for a moment, and then he kept walking, and Clara pretended she hadn't seen him stop. The trouble arrived at the end of the first week, and it arrived in the form of a woman named Mabel Drury. Mabel Drury was the wife of the man who ran the general store in the nearest town, a place called Harwick, 3 miles down the main road. She was in her early 60s with a way of presenting herself that suggested authority she hadn't been formally given, but had simply claimed through the years, and she arrived at Cedar Hollow on a Tuesday afternoon in a buggy driven by her hired man, sitting very straight. Clara was hanging washing on the line in the side yard when the buggy came through the gate. She watched it come up the track and felt something in her stomach tighten. Not quite fear, but the specific alertness of a person who has been judged by too many strangers and learned to read the shape of incoming judgment. Mabel Drury got down from the buggy without being helped. She looked at Clara the way people look at something they've already decided is out of place. "You're the woman Nathan Carter let in," she said. "My name is Clara Whitmore." "I know what your name is." She looked at the washing on the line, Nathan's shirts, Lily's dress, James's small trousers. "I heard about you from Douglas Brandt." The name meant nothing to Clara yet. It would, later. For now, it was just a name. "I see," Clara said. "Do you?" Mabel tilted her head slightly. "Mr. Brandt says you were turned away from Ridgecrest, and 2 other towns before that." 4 towns, Clara said. "I don't see the point in understating it." That landed differently than Mabel expected. Clara could see her recalibrate. "Nathan Carter is a good man," Mabel said, shifting ground. "He's been through a great deal. His children have been through a great deal." "I know. He doesn't need, complications." What kind of complications? Mabel pressed her lips together. A woman of uncertain background, living in a widower's house. There it was. Clara finished pinning the shirt she was holding to the line before she responded. She took her time with it, got the pins right, smoothed the collar. Mrs. Drury, she said, I am working for my room and board. I cook, I clean, I care for his children. That is all that is happening here. People will talk. People are already talking. Mr. Brandt made sure of that before I'd been here a full day. She picked up the next piece of washing. I can't control what people say. I can only control what I do. Mabel stared at her. She wasn't used to being answered like this, not rudely, not aggressively, but directly, squarely, like the person answering had thought through what they were saying and meant each word. I came to speak to Nathan, she said, slightly redirecting. He's in the north field. I'll tell him you called. Mabel hesitated. She had expected to be let into the house. Clara hadn't invited her. She wasn't being rude about it. She simply hadn't extended an invitation that wasn't hers to extend. After a moment, Mabel got back into the buggy. Then she paused and looked back at Clara with an expression that was less hostile than it had been a few minutes ago, and more uncertain. The Carter children, she said. How are they? It was a genuine question. Whatever else Mabel Drury was, she cared about Lily and James. James came out of his room on his own last Tuesday, Clara said. Lily is learning to make bread. Something shifted in Mabel's face. She looked at the house for a moment, then back at Clara, and whatever she was thinking, she kept it. Good day, Miss Whitmore, she said, and the buggy turned and went back through the gate. Nathan was not happy when Clara told him about Mabel's visit. He came in from the field at dusk and listened to her account over the dinner she'd made, a beef stew that used the tougher cut from the cold store and a slow cook that made it something worth eating, and the look on his face got progressively tighter. She mentioned Brandt, he said. Yes. What exactly did he say about you? She didn't specify. Clara sat across from him. Lily and James were already in bed. Who is Douglas Brandt? Nathan was quiet for a moment. He owns the Brandt Holdings, southeast of here, about 4,000 acres. He stopped, started again. He's been interested in Cedar Hollow for a while. Interested how? The kind of interested where someone keeps finding reasons to bring up what a hard time you're having. Clara looked at her stew. Does he know about the water problem? The question surprised him. He knows the fields have been struggling, same as everyone. Does he know why they've been struggling? Nathan set down his spoon. What are you getting at? I'm not getting at anything yet, she said honestly. I just want to understand the whole picture. He studied her. He did that a lot. Studied her like she was a map he was trying to read. Brandt has a water source on his eastern boundary. If our channel stays dead, our lower pasture goes next season. If the lower pasture goes, the ranch becomes worth less. Or worth nothing, depending on the year. Clara was quiet for a moment. I'd like to look for those survey maps, if they exist. Why? Because I want to see where the original channel was laid and why. Because if the blockage is where I think it is, clearing it might not be as expensive as your men told you. She paused. And because I think someone should understand this land completely before anyone else gets the chance to define what it's worth. Nathan looked at her for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. The lamp put a circle of light on the table between them. There's an attic, he said at last. I haven't been up there since Margaret died. There are boxes. I don't need you to go up there. Just tell me if I can. He nodded once. Then he picked up his spoon again. Thank you for dinner, he said. It was the first time he'd said that. Clara found the maps on a Friday, 2.5 weeks after she arrived. The attic was difficult in the way attics always are. Low ceiling, poor light, the accumulated evidence of a life organized around permanence that had then become impermanent. Boxes labeled in a woman's handwriting, a rocking chair with a missing spindle, a child's wooden horse that had been painted and repainted so many times the color underneath couldn't be identified anymore. Clara moved through it carefully. She didn't open the personal boxes. She looked for anything that seemed like property documents, anything official, anything with the clean, flat surface of something that had been filed. She found them in a tin box behind a leather trunk tied with twine that crumbled when she touched it. 3 pages of survey document, hand-drawn, with measurements in a precise old script and notations in the margins in 2 different hands. An official hand and then another, smaller, someone who'd been adding observations over time. She brought them down to the kitchen table and spread them out. She found what she was looking for in under 20 minutes. The channel hadn't been built where Nathan's men had told him it was. Or rather, it had been built there at first, but at some point, decades ago, it had been extended. There was a secondary run that went farther into the upper slope, drawing from a spring source that was marked on the original survey with a notation that said, "reliable year-round" in that smaller secondary hand. And someone had closed it off. Not broke it. Closed it. There was a notation, recent, in pencil, not the same hand as any of the others, that said only, diverted. 1887. Clara sat back and looked at that word, diverted, not blocked by debris, not failed by age. Diverted. By someone, deliberately, 9 years ago. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about Douglas Brandt. She thought about the eastern boundary and the water source, and the way Nathan had said he's been interested in Cedar Hollow for a while, with the particular tone of a man who'd been slowly pressed on a bruise for so long that he'd stopped noticing it anymore. She didn't say anything to Nathan that night. She needed to think. She needed to be sure. Because the thing she was beginning to understand about Cedar Hollow was that its problems were not all weather and hard seasons and a man paralyzed by grief. Some of its problems had edges. Some of them were shaped like someone else's hands. She folded the maps carefully and put them in the tin box and carried the tin box to her room and set it on the shelf above the bed. The ranch hands knew she was staying by the end of the second week, and they had opinions. There were 3 of them. A man named Hal, who was older and mostly kept his head down. A younger man named Pete, who smiled too much in a way that meant nothing. And a third man named Roy, who had been with the ranch for 7 years and believed that 7 years gave him certain understandings about how Cedar Hollow should operate. Roy had opinions about Clara specifically. She found this out on a Wednesday morning when she came to the barn to return a harness she'd mended. The stitching on 2 of the buckle points had come loose, and she'd re-sewn it the night before, and Roy was there with Pete, and she caught the tail end of something Roy was saying. She caught the word useful, said with a particular inflection. She set the harness on the rail and said, "Roy." He turned. He wasn't embarrassed. He was the kind of man who didn't embarrass easily, which was its own kind of problem. "Good morning," he said, in the tone of someone who doesn't actually think it's good. "This is mended," she said, indicating the harness. "The left buckle especially. Don't pull it at an angle or you'll stress the new stitching." Roy looked at the harness. He picked it up. He examined the stitching with the slow deliberateness of a man who wanted to find something wrong with it. He didn't find anything wrong. He set it back down. "Thank you," he said, in the same tone as before. "You're welcome." She turned to go. "Must be nice," Roy said behind her, "knowing how to make yourself useful in a man's house." She stopped. She didn't turn around. "I worked for 7 years for a woman who ran an estate with 40 employees," Clara said to the barn door in front of her. "I managed the supply accounts, the staff schedule, the kitchen, and the property maintenance records. She trusted me with things she didn't trust her own son with." She turned then, and she looked at Roy directly. "So yes, I do know how to make myself useful. That's not an accident." Roy looked at her. Pete was very carefully examining the middle distance. "Yes, ma'am," Roy said. Still that tone, but something underneath it had shifted just slightly. She walked back to the house. Hal caught up with her halfway across the yard. He was a quiet man, Hal. She'd noticed that he noticed things without saying much about them. "Don't mind Roy," he said, falling into step beside her. "I don't mind him. He doesn't bother me." "He bothers a lot of people." "I know. That's his problem." She slowed slightly. "How long has Nathan been managing this alone?" "Since his wife died?" Hal was quiet a moment. "Margaret passed 2.5 years ago. Nathan's been running it alone since about 6 months before that, when she got too sick to—" He stopped. "It's been hard on him." "I know. He's not unfriendly by nature. He used to be different." Hal glanced at her sideways. He opened the gate for you, which is... He seemed to choose a word carefully. That's something. Clara looked at the house. From out here, she could see the shutter that was still hanging at its angle, the beam still propping it. She'd been meaning to fix that shutter. She hadn't gotten to it yet. He opened the gate, she said. I intend to make sure he doesn't regret it. Hal nodded, slowly. They walked the rest of the way in silence, and Clara counted it as the closest thing to an ally she'd found on this ranch so far. That afternoon, she fixed the shutter. She borrowed a ladder from the barn and a handful of new nails from the supply box, and climbed up and reattached the hinges properly, and then she came down and removed the wooden beam and checked the swing. The shutter moved freely, cleanly, on new pins. She didn't tell anyone she'd done it. Nathan noticed at dusk when he came in from the far field and looked up at the house from the yard. He stood there for a moment. He looked at the shutter. He looked around the yard like he was trying to find the evidence of who had done it. Clara was in the kitchen starting dinner. He came inside and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. The shutter, he said, needed new hinges. I found some in the supply box. He was quiet. Nathan, she said, not stopping what she was doing, where did you put the beam you were using to prop it? I moved it to the side of the porch. It took him a second. I'll move it back to the barn. Thank you. He didn't move immediately. He stood in the doorway for another moment. Clara, he said. She looked at him. His face had the particular expression of a man trying to say something that didn't fit any shape he'd practiced. I know I'm not... He stopped, started again. I know this place isn't easy, and I haven't been... Another stop. You don't have to, she said. I want to. She waited. I haven't been fair to you, he said. I've been waiting for you to leave, watching for it. I know I have. He looked at the wall, then back at her. It's not a judgment of you. It's just what I've learned to expect. I know, Clara said. You're not them, he said. She heard her own words from the porch 3 weeks ago come back at her from his mouth, and something in her chest shifted in a way she didn't entirely want to examine. No, she said quietly. I'm not. He nodded. He went back outside to get the beam, and Clara turned back to the stove, and the kitchen was warm, and somewhere above her head Lily was talking to James about something. She could hear the murmur of it through the ceiling, and the ranch was still broken in a dozen ways she hadn't fixed yet, and the survey maps were in the tin box on her shelf, and whatever Douglas Brandt had diverted 9 years ago was still waiting out there in the dark of the upper slope. But tonight, there was stew on the stove, and a shutter that didn't hang wrong anymore. That was enough. For tonight, that was enough. She showed Nathan the maps on a Saturday morning, 3 days after she'd found them. She had waited because she needed to be certain of what she was looking at before she said anything. She'd spent those 3 days reading the survey documents in the early morning hours before the house woke up, cross-referencing the notations against the land she could see from the upper yard, walking out to the edge of the north field after dinner while the light was still good enough to check distances against what the original measurements showed. She had borrowed a length of rope from the barn and a wooden stake and tested angles. She had gotten mud on her coat and a blister on her right heel, and she had become as certain as she was going to get without physically digging into the hillside. She laid the maps on the kitchen table after breakfast when Lily and James had gone out to the kitchen garden. James checked the tomato plants every morning now with the devotion of someone monitoring something they'd personally invested in. And she stood next to Nathan and walked him through it slowly, pointing to each notation, tracing the line of the original channel and then the extension, and finally stopping her finger on the word written in pencil in the margin. Diverted. 1887. Nathan stared at it. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Clara watched his face, the way the information moved through him, first as data he was processing, then as something that connected to something else, then as something that had weight. 9 years ago, he said. Yes. Margaret and I bought this place 12 years ago. The channel was already struggling when we arrived. We thought it was age, thought the source had just diminished. His jaw tightened. The men I had look at it. They said there was nothing to be done. Who recommended those men? He looked at her, slow, then sharp. Roy found them, through a contact. Do you know whose contact? Nathan was very still. Roy's been with me 7 years, he said, but he said it carefully, like a man testing the weight of something he'd trusted without thinking about it. I'm not saying Roy knew what he was doing, Clara said. I'm saying someone sent men who told you the channel was broken when it wasn't. Someone had motive for that conclusion. Nathan pulled out the chair and sat down. He looked at the map for a long time without speaking. Outside, she could hear James saying something to Lily about the tomatoes. His voice pitched high, with the specific excitement of someone who has found evidence of growth. Brant, Nathan said finally. Not a question. The diversion is on the upper slope. That's your land, not his. But if you trace the redirected water line, she put her finger on the survey again. It runs northeast, which is toward his eastern boundary. He's been taking my water. For 9 years, if this is right. Maybe longer, if the diversion was extended. She paused. And the men who told you it wasn't fixable made sure you'd stop looking. Nathan's hand on the table had closed into something that wasn't quite a fist. Why didn't he just try to buy the land? He's made offers before. What kind of offers? Low ones. Insultingly low, which I thought he was testing me, seeing what I'd take. He looked up at her. If the water's been cut off, the land's less valuable. Lower pasture dies, upper pasture dries out eventually. The ranch goes under and he buys it for nothing. Or you sell because you need to, Clara said, and you never know why you really had to. The kitchen was very quiet. Nathan stood up. He went to the window over the sink and stood there looking out at the yard. Clara waited. She'd learned by now that Nathan processed things physically. He needed to move or stand or look at something else while his mind caught up with what he'd been told. I want to see it, he said. The diversion. I want to see it myself. I can show you where I think it is. We'd need to dig to confirm. Then we dig. They went up the next morning, early, before the ranch hands were fully started, because Nathan wasn't ready to involve Roy, and he hadn't decided yet what Roy's role in this was. Clara brought the survey maps folded in her coat pocket. Hal, who Nathan had decided to trust after a long private conversation Clara hadn't been part of, came with a short-handled spade and a longer one. The upper slope was steep enough to make the walk hard, and the ground was uneven from old frost heaves that had never been smoothed. Clara's repaired boots held mostly, though the left one was starting to separate at the back seam in a new place. She didn't mention it. She found the spot by measuring from the 2 landmarks marked on the survey. An old post that was now half rotted but still standing, and a particular shelf of rock that jutted from the hillside at a specific angle. She stood between them and walked the distance the survey specified and crouched down. The ground here was damp, noticeably damp in a season that had been dry. She pointed at it. Here. Hal dug. It took 20 minutes. The soil was compacted but not hard, and 18 inches down, Hal's spade hit something that wasn't rock. It was timber, old timber, fitted into the channel bed with stones packed tight around it. A wooden gate, crude but deliberate, wedged into the channel and then buried. Nathan crouched down and looked at it. He reached into the hole and put his hand on the timber and held it there. Clara watched him. She watched his shoulders, the exact line of them, and she saw the moment when what this had been done to him, moved from his head down into his body. Someone came onto my land, he said. Yes. Buried this. Yes. While Margaret was sick. His voice had gone very level, the particular level of a person keeping something contained that is not small. While I was watching her die and trying to keep this place running, someone came onto my land and killed the lower pasture and let me think it was my own failure. Hal was looking at the horizon, giving Nathan what privacy you could give a man crouching over a hole in a hillside. We can clear it, Clara said. Not just pull the timber, clear the whole channel back to where the main flow diverts. It'll take a few days, but the water should come through. She paused. But Nathan, before we do that, you should talk to someone who knows property law, because if we clear it, Brant loses his water supply. And if Brant loses his water supply, he's going to come after this ranch in every other way he can find. Nathan looked up at her. I'm not saying don't clear it, she said. I'm saying go in prepared. He looked back at the timber in the ground. He was quiet for a long time. There's a man in Casper, he said finally, a land attorney. He handled the original deed. I haven't spoken to him in years. Can you reach him? I can ride out Monday. Then ride Monday. And until then, she looked at Hal, then back at Nathan. We don't mention this to anyone else. Hal nodded without being asked to. Nathan stood up. He looked at the hole, at the timber, at the damp ground around it. Then he looked out across the slope toward the lower pasture, which was brown and cracked from 18 months without proper water, and Clara could see him calculating. The seasons, the cost, the time. How long until we'd see water in the lower pasture, he asked. If we cleared it now. If the channel's intact below the diversion, a week, maybe less. He nodded. Then he said, cover it back up, for now. Hal covered it. They walked back down the slope without talking much, and Clara felt the weight of what they'd found settle into the walk. Not crushing, but present. The kind of weight that comes from knowing something has changed that cannot be unchanged. Douglas Brandt made his move 12 days later. He came to Cedar Hollow not himself, but through a man named Whitfield, who arrived carrying a leather satchel and introduced himself as a legal representative and asked to speak with Nathan. Clara answered the door and looked at the satchel and said Nathan was in the field and Whitfield could wait or he could leave a card. He waited. He sat in the front room, which Clara had not invited him to make himself comfortable in, and looked around at everything in the way of a man who was already calculating square footage. Nathan came in 30 minutes later. He looked at Whitfield and then at Clara, and Clara gave him a very small nod, and he sat down across from the man with his field dirt still on his boots. Whitfield explained that his client had recently had a survey conducted of the land along the shared boundary between Brandt Holdings and Cedar Hollow Ranch, and that survey had identified a discrepancy in the original property line that suggested a portion of the upper slope, specifically the section containing the main channel head, might legally fall within Brandt's property. Nathan said nothing. He looked at the man. Whitfield put a document on the table. My client would be willing to resolve this matter privately rather than through the county court. He proposes a boundary adjustment to be compensated with a payment of— Where did this survey come from? Nathan said. Whitfield blinked. As I said, my client commissioned— When was it conducted? Last month. Last month. Nathan looked at the document without touching it. And the original survey? The original documentation predates— I have the original documentation, Nathan said. I have a survey dated to the year this land was first registered, with notations, with measurements, with the original surveyor's signature. And I have a land attorney in Casper who has reviewed it. He paused. We found some other things in that documentation too, things my attorney found very interesting. Whitfield's composure shifted, not visibly exactly, but Clara, watching from the kitchen doorway, felt the change in the room the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Mr. Carter, Whitfield said, my client is simply seeking— Tell your client, Nathan said, that he should stop seeking things on my property. The meeting ended shortly after that. Whitfield picked up his document— Nathan hadn't touched it— and went to his horse and left. Nathan sat in the front room for a moment after the sound of the horse had faded. Clara came in and sat across from him, in the chair Whitfield had just vacated. He'll come back, Nathan said. Yes. With something worse. Probably. Nathan rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man who is tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. What would you do, if it were your decision? The question surprised her, not because it was unreasonable, because no one had asked her something like that in a long time, treated her like someone whose answer mattered to strategy. I'd clear the channel, she said, this week, before he can file anything with the county that clouds the water rights. Get the water moving, document it, show the lower pasture recovery. Evidence is better than argument. And the community meeting next month. He looked at her. The ranchers in the valley do a quarterly meeting at the Harwick Hall. Brandt will be there. So will you. He has more influence than I do. Half those ranchers owe him something. They owe him debts, Claire said. That's different from owing him loyalty. And if what he's done to your water becomes known before that meeting— She stopped. Then they'll know it could happen to them, Nathan said quietly. Yes. He thought about it. He looked at the window, then back at her. Clara, he said, why are you doing this? And I know what the arrangement is, but this... He indicated the space around him, meaning all of it. The maps, the meetings, the attorney, the channel. This isn't cooking and minding children. She held his gaze. No, it isn't. So why? She thought about the 4 towns. She thought about the general store in Harwick, Douglas Brandt's casual voice. We don't take in strays. She thought about that word, diverted, written in pencil in someone else's margin, the specific small cruelty of it, something done in the dark while a man was watching his wife die. Because something that's been made to look like failure isn't always failure, she said. Sometimes it's been deliberately broken. And I find that... She paused, looking for the honest word. I find that intolerable. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, not in 6 weeks. Not the wariness, not the careful distance, not the watchfulness of a man waiting for the next person to leave. Something that was quieter than all of that, and more permanent. He looked away first. We clear the channel Monday, he said. They cleared the channel starting Monday morning, and it took 3 days. Nathan, Hal, and Clara worked it in sections, pulling the timber dam first, then clearing the decades of debris that had accumulated behind it, then following the channel down the slope to where it had silted over from disuse and clearing that too, section by section, working in the cold of early morning until the light went. Claire's hands blistered on the 2nd day, and she wrapped them with cloth cut from an old shirt and kept working. Nathan saw her do it and said nothing, which was its own kind of respect. Pete helped on the 2nd day, which meant Roy knew by that evening. Roy came to Nathan that night and said he'd heard they were working on the upper channel, and he said it with a careful face, and Nathan looked at him for a long moment and said yes. They'd found something interesting in the old surveys and watched Roy's face for a reaction. Roy's face gave nothing. But that night Clara lay awake and thought about Roy and the men he'd brought in 2 years ago, and the word diverted, and she did not come to any conclusion that made her feel easy. The water came through on Wednesday afternoon. Not dramatically. There was no rush, no sudden flood. It started as a seep at the lower end of the channel, just a darkening of the dry earth, and then a trickle, and then within an hour a steady flow moving through the cut toward the lower pasture. Clara stood at the edge of the pasture and watched the water find the ground, watched the cracked clay begin to darken and soften, and felt something she didn't have a clean name for. Nathan stood beside her. He didn't speak for a long time. Lily had come down from the house and was standing a little behind them, looking at the water. James was beside her, gripping the hem of her coat. Is that our water? James asked. That's our water, Nathan said. Where was it? Nathan looked at Clara. It was an instinct, Clara thought, the kind you don't plan. He looked at her the way people look at the person who will know the right answer. It was lost for a while, Clara said to James, but it found its way back. James thought about this seriously. Then he said, like things can. Like things can, she said. What happened next came faster than Clara had anticipated. The news of the restored channel moved through the valley the way news always moved in small ranch communities. Not through any one person's deliberate telling, but through the accumulation of small sightings. The darkened earth of the lower pasture was visible from the road. Water flowing in a channel that had been dry for years was the kind of thing neighboring ranchers noticed. Within a week, 2 families had come by to ask about it. Genuine curiosity, neighborly interest. And Nathan had explained carefully and factually what they'd found. Brandt heard about it. Brandt reacted. The second document arrived not through Whitfield, but through the county office, delivered by a clerk who didn't look Nathan in the eye. It was a formal filing. A claim of disputed water rights based on the newly commissioned Brandt survey, asserting that the water source feeding the Cedar Hollow Channel originated on land that was in contested ownership. Nathan brought it to Clara. She read it twice. She read it carefully the way she read everything, looking for what was actually being claimed versus what was being implied. He's not claiming your land anymore, she said. No. He's claiming the water source, specifically. She looked at the filing again. He can't claim the land. The original survey is too clear. So he's claiming the water is his because the spring head is allegedly on his property. She looked up. Is there any chance the spring head is on his property? I don't know, Nathan said. The original survey shows it on mine, but the survey only goes to the registered boundary. Who was the original surveyor, Nathan thought. A man named Aldous Crew. He was the county surveyor. Retired by now, probably. Is he still alive? I don't know. Clara looked at the filing again. We need to find him, she said. If he's alive, his testimony about where the spring head sits is worth more than any new survey Brandt commissioned. Nathan rubbed the back of his neck. Casper's a day's ride. The county records are there. Then someone needs to go to Casper. He looked at her. I can't leave the ranch right now. Not with this. He gestured at the filing. I'll go, Clara said. Alone? I've traveled alone before. She said it without self-pity. It was just a fact. I'll take the morning and be back by evening the next day if the roads are good. Nathan was quiet. He looked at the filing, then at her. Clara, if Brandt finds out you've gone to Casper looking for Crew, then he finds out, she said. I'm not hiding it. I'm just moving faster than he expects. The look on Nathan's face was complicated. The pull between wanting to stop her, the understanding that he had no reasonable grounds to, and something else underneath both of those that Clara chose not to examine too closely at that moment. Take Hal's horse, he said. Yours is slower. She left the next morning before sunrise, with the survey maps in the satchel from the barn and the Brandt filing folded into her coat pocket, and enough food for the road in a cloth bag she'd packed the night before. Lily was awake when she came downstairs. She often was, that early, and stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Clara prepare to leave. You're coming back, Lily said. Not a question, exactly. Something that lived between a question and an instruction. Tomorrow evening, Clara said. If the roads are good. They might not be good. Then the day after. She looked at Lily. I'm coming back, I promise you that. It was the first time she'd made that specific promise to anyone in a long time. Lily came across the kitchen and hugged her, quickly, fiercely, with the full commitment of a child who has been cautious about this for weeks and has finally decided that caution isn't worth what it costs. Clara held her for a moment. She felt the thin shoulders under her hands, the warm weight of the girl against her coat. Keep an eye on the lower pasture, Clara said when they separated. Tell me if the color changes. I want to know how fast it's coming back. Lily nodded. She was holding herself together with the particular effort of someone who doesn't want to be seen doing it. Clara picked up her bag and went out into the dark. The road to Casper was long and cold, and she passed two other riders going the opposite direction, both of whom looked at her briefly and looked away without speaking. The indifference of strangers on a road was, she'd found, easier than the hostility of strangers in a town. At least indifference was honest. She found Aldous Crew not at the county records office, but through the records clerk, who told her Crew had retired to a small house on the south side of Casper and was nearly 80, but still had most of his faculties and strong opinions about surveying. The clerk said this last part with the particular weariness of someone who'd heard those opinions recently. The house was small and tidy. The man who answered the door was ancient in the way that some very old people managed to be. Not diminished, but concentrated, like the years had refined rather than reduced him. He had large hands for a man his size and eyes that were still sharp and a face that had gone to deep lines. Clara introduced herself. She explained, standing on his porch, what she was looking for and why. She didn't dress it up. Aldous Crew looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You'd better come inside." He remembered Cedar Hollow. He remembered it clearly, which was remarkable for a survey he'd conducted over 30 years ago. But he explained that Cedar Hollow had been one of the more interesting jobs of his career because of the spring, a spring that in his professional assessment was one of the most reliable sources in that part of the valley, and that sat clearly and unambiguously on the Carter property as it had been registered. He remembered also that someone had tried to contest that registration in the years after. He said it with the directness of a very old man who was past the point of softening things. He had not remembered the name at first, but when Clara said Brandt, he nodded slowly. That was the name, he said. Made noise about it for a while. then stopped. He didn't stop, Clara said. He diverted the channel instead. Aldous Crew looked at her. His old hands were flat on the table. Is that so? 9 years ago. We found the timber dam ourselves, buried in the channel bed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What do you need from me? A signed statement. From you, as the original surveyor of record, confirming the location of the spring head and the property boundary, something we can bring to the community meeting in Harwick. He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze and let him look. Who are you to the Carter Ranch? He asked. It was a reasonable question. She was nobody to it, officially. She was a woman who cooked and cleaned and mended in exchange for a roof and food, and she had walked 11 days to get there, and somewhere in the past 6 weeks she had become something else to it that she hadn't fully defined. I work there, she said, and I believe the ranch should survive. Aldous Crew looked at his hands. Then he said, Get me paper. He wrote the statement himself, in the careful, precise script of a man who had spent his life writing measurements, and he signed it and dated it and pressed his old surveyor's seal into the wax she found in his kitchen drawer. When Clara rode back toward Cedar Hollow the next afternoon, she had the signed statement in her inside coat pocket, pressed against her ribs, and the road was cold and the sky was heavy with cloud. And she thought about the community meeting in 11 days, and Douglas Brant standing in that hall, and what he was going to say when he saw what she'd brought back. She thought about Lily standing in the kitchen doorway that morning saying, You're coming back. She pushed Hal's horse a little faster. The lower pasture was visibly greener by the time she could see it from the road. Just the faintest change. The beginnings of color coming back into ground that had been starved for nearly 2 years. You wouldn't have noticed it if you hadn't been watching. But Clara had told Lily to watch. And when she came through the gate that evening, Lily was on the porch. It's changing, Lily said before Clara had even dismounted. The lower pasture. You can see it from the upper fence. The color's coming back. I know, Clara said. I saw it on the road. Lily came down from the porch and helped hold the horse while Clara dismounted. It was a practical gesture, a ranch girl's gesture. And it struck Clara not for the first time that Lily had been quietly learning to be capable without anyone formally teaching her. She'd just been watching, picking things up. The way children do when they're paying attention and someone is doing things worth paying attention to. Nathan came out from the barn. He looked at Clara. He looked at the satchel. He looked at her face. You found him, he said. I found him. She reached into her coat and held out the document. He remembered everything. Nathan took it. He read it standing there in the yard in the fading light, and she watched him read it, and she watched what it did to his face. The careful reading, the moment when something in him that had been braced for a long time began to consider the possibility of not bracing. He looked up. Clara. There's a meeting in 11 days, she said. That's what we have. He nodded. He was still holding the document with both hands. She took the satchel from the saddle and walked past him toward the house, and her left boot was coming apart at the back seam for certain now, and she was hungry and tired from 2 days of hard riding, and the document was in Nathan's hands, and the water was in the lower pasture, and the community meeting was 11 days away. That night she sat at the kitchen table after everyone had gone to bed, and she took out the Brant filing and the survey maps and Crew's statement, and she laid them all out together and looked at them. She was not afraid of the meeting. She was not afraid of Brant. What she was, and she allowed herself to feel it, in the quiet of the kitchen with the lamp burning low, was tired of having to fight this hard for the right to simply exist somewhere. Tired in the deep, specific way that had nothing to do with the ride to Casper, or the channel work, or the 3 weeks of hard labor before that. Tired of being a person who had to prove herself continuously, in every room, from the beginning, every time. She folded the documents carefully. She put them in the tin box. She put the tin box on the shelf above her bed and lay down and stared at the ceiling and listened to the ranch at night. The sounds of the animals settling, the wind across the slope, somewhere far off the sound of water moving in a channel that was open again after 9 years. She let that last sound be enough. The 11 days before the community meeting were the longest Clara had spent at Cedar Hollow, and that was saying something because none of the days there had been easy. The work continued, but it always continued, There was no pause in a working ranch for the luxury of focusing on one problem at a time. But underneath everything else, the meeting sat like a stone in still water, its weight present in every conversation, every meal, every moment of quiet. Nathan was tighter than usual, which she hadn't thought was possible. He moved through the days with a careful efficiency that she recognized as controlled anxiety, the kind that comes from a person who cannot afford to fall apart and knows it. Clara let him be. She didn't push him to talk about what was coming. She understood by now that Nathan Carter processed things in his own time, and that rushing him produced nothing useful. What she did instead was prepare, quietly and thoroughly, the way she did everything. She copied Crew's statement in her own hand twice, once for backup, once for the county attorney Nathan had sent word to in Casper. She organized the original survey maps into a sequence that told the story clearly, in order, so that someone unfamiliar with the documents could follow the chain of evidence without needing it explained. She wrote a summary, 2 pages, plain language, no legal flourish, just the facts in the order they had occurred. The channel, the diversion, the date, the men who'd been sent to say nothing could be done, the water restored, the spring head's location confirmed by the man who had originally surveyed and registered it. She did all of this at the kitchen table after midnight, when the house was quiet and the lamp was the only light. She did it the way she did most things that mattered, without announcing it, without asking for credit, because the doing was what counted. On the 5th day before the meeting, Roy came to her. She was in the kitchen garden checking the tomatoes. They had recovered beyond what she'd initially projected. The staked plant standing straight now with actual fruit forming, small and green but present. When she heard his step on the path behind her and turned. Roy had never sought her out directly. In the weeks since the scene in the barn, he'd maintained a careful distance that was neither hostile nor warm, just a deliberate neutral, the kind a man maintains when he's reassessing something and hasn't finished yet. He stopped at the edge of the garden. He had his hat in his hands, which she noticed. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Roy." He looked at the tomatoes. Those came back. They did. A silence. He turned his hat over once in his hands. "I heard you went to Casper, found the old surveyor." "Yes." "I heard what you found in the channel." He said it carefully. "The timber dam." Clara watched him. "What about it?" Roy looked at his hat. "The men I brought in, 2 years ago. The ones who said the channel wasn't worth fixing." He stopped. Started again. "I found them through a contact at the Brandt Holdings. I didn't know—" He pressed his lips together. "I didn't ask enough questions about why they were so quick to say it was hopeless." Clara was quiet. She let the silence stay where it was. "I'm not making excuses," Roy said. "I should have looked harder. I knew Nathan needed that water, and I brought in men who told him it was gone, and I didn't question it because they seemed to know what they were talking about." He finally looked up at her. "I didn't know they were Brandts." "Do you know it now?" "I found out." He held her gaze. "After you cleared the channel. After I started thinking about how fast they'd concluded it was hopeless." He paused. "I went back and asked around." Clara studied him. He wasn't a dishonest man. She'd suspected that even when she'd been wary of him. He was a proud man who had made a lazy mistake with serious consequences, and the difference between those two things mattered. "Roy," she said, "at the community meeting, Nathan is going to need people around him who are actually on his side, not neutral, not watchful." She picked a yellowing leaf off one of the tomato plants. "Are you on his side?" Roy straightened. Something in him settled, the way a post settles when you drive it properly into the ground. 7 years, he said. "I've worked this ranch 7 years. I should have been paying better attention." "That's not what I asked." "Yes," he said. "I'm on his side." She nodded once. "Then be there. And if you remember anything else about those men, or who sent them, write it down, date it, sign it. We may need it." Roy put his hat back on. He looked at the tomato plants one more time. "They really did come back," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't about the tomatoes at all. "Things do," Clara said. "If you don't give up on them too early." He left, and Clara watched him go, and filed it in the column of things that were better than they had been a week ago. Nathan told her about Margaret 3 nights before the meeting. It wasn't planned. She could tell that. They were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, the children in bed. The document spread between them as they'd been doing most evenings, going over the sequence, anticipating what Brant might challenge and how to answer it. And then Nathan stopped in the middle of a sentence and looked at the table and said nothing for a long moment. Clara waited. She would have seen Brant for what he was, Nathan said. Margaret. From the first meeting. She had that. He moved his hand, searching for the word. She saw through people. I don't have that. You saw through him eventually. I didn't. You did. I was so deep in everything else that I couldn't see past my own fence line. He rubbed his thumb across the edge of the survey map. She would have had those maps out within the first season, would have walked the channel herself. I kept telling myself I'd get to it when things steadied, and things never steadied. Clara looked at him. Nathan, you were watching your wife die and running this ranch and raising 2 children. I know. That's not failure. That's a man doing more than one person can do. I lost 2 years of water. Brant took 2 years of water. There's a difference. She said it quietly, but she said it firmly. And you didn't lose the land. You didn't sell. You're still here. The channel's running. He looked at her. His face in the lamplight had the particular openness that comes out in people late at night when they're tired enough that the habitual defenses have gone soft. Why doesn't it feel like enough? She held his gaze. Because grief doesn't care about your balance sheet, she said. It doesn't matter that the ranch is still standing. You still lost her. Those are 2 separate things, and neither one cancels the other out. Something in Nathan's face shifted, moved, like something long fixed had been gently loosened. He looked away, out the window, at the dark of the yard. Lily sets 4 plates sometimes, he said. At dinner. Did you know that? Yes. Does she? He stopped. She catches herself, Clara said. She puts the 4th one back. Every time. She paused. She knows. She just forgets for a second, and then she remembers. I think that's how grief works at 8 years old. Nathan put his face in his hands, not crying, not quite, just covering it for a moment, the way you cover a light that's suddenly too bright. Clara sat across from him and didn't move and didn't speak and didn't look away. After a moment, he put his hands down. His eyes were dry, but there were lines in his face she hadn't seen before, or perhaps had seen but was only now recognizing for what they were. I don't know how to thank you, he said, for... He gestured again, indicating everything, all of it. You don't have to thank me. I want to. Then just show up at that meeting, she said. Stand up straight and say what's true. That's all I need from you right now. He almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile. His face wasn't ready for that yet, with everything still sitting heavy on it, but it was the beginning of one. And Clara noted it and held it and tucked it somewhere careful. I can do that, he said. I know you can. They went back to the documents. They sat there another hour, going over and over the sequence until Nathan could recite it without looking at the pages, until it lived in him rather than on paper. When Clara finally put the documents away and said good night, she was at the kitchen doorway when Nathan said her name. She turned. She would have liked you, he said. Margaret. He said it simply, without drama. I think she would have liked you very much. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment. She felt the weight of that, the specific gravity of being seen by someone through the eyes of someone you'd never meet. Get some sleep, she said quietly. We have 11 days of work to walk into a room and defend. She went upstairs and the house was quiet, and she lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling and felt, under the tiredness and the worry about the meeting, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Something that didn't have a clean single word but was made of smaller things, belonging and purpose and the strange warmth of being known by someone, even incompletely, even imperfectly, in a place you'd arrived at with a broken boot and nowhere else to go. The night before the Harwick meeting, Brant made his move against Clara specifically. She didn't know it was coming. She should have. She'd known he would find another angle when the water rights challenge got complicated, but she'd been so focused on the documents and the evidence that she'd left herself open in the one place she couldn't defend with paper: her past. She found out the way bad news always arrived in small communities, indirectly, through someone who thought they were being kind. Mabel Drury came to Cedar Hollow in the late afternoon, and this time Clara let her in because Mabel had changed since their first encounter at the clothesline. She came in and sat at the kitchen table, and she did the thing that well-meaning people sometimes do, which is deliver terrible news with a face full of concern that doesn't help. "I think you should know," Mabel said, "what Douglas Brandt has been saying about you." Clara set down her coffee cup. "Tell me," Mabel told her. Brandt had been talking to every rancher family in the valley for the past 3 days. He had a story about Clara's past, not the whole truth, not a lie exactly, but the specific selection of facts arranged in the specific order that made something look like something it wasn't. He knew about the employer who had died and left Clara without a position. He knew, or claimed to know, about a dispute over the estate accounting that Clara had been named in. He was using the word discrepancy. He was using the phrase questions were raised. Clara knew what he was referring to. She knew it was not what he was implying. And she knew that in a room full of people who didn't know her, implication was frequently more powerful than fact. "How many people has he told?" she asked. "Most of them," Mabel said. "I'm sorry. I said I'd met you, and you seemed—" She shook her head. "But he's been doing it so carefully, not accusing, just raising questions. And people listen to questions," Clara said. "Yes." Clara was quiet. She sat with it. The particular feeling of having your past used as a weapon by someone who didn't know it and wouldn't care about the truth of it if they did. It was not a new feeling. It was a feeling she'd been carrying in some form since before she'd walked 11 days across Wyoming, and it sat in her stomach now with the familiar weight of something she'd learned to live with but had never learned to not feel. Mabel was watching her with a mix of guilt and worry. "What are you going to do?" Clara thought about it. She thought about the option of preparing a defense, gathering evidence of the estate dispute's resolution, the letter of clearance from the solicitor she'd kept in the bottom of her suitcase for 3 years and never had to use. She thought about the option of saying nothing, letting Nathan's documents speak and hoping Brandt's mud didn't stick. And then she thought about Lily at the kitchen table with the 4th plate in her hands, and James coming out of his hiding place, and Nathan in the lamplight saying she would have liked you, and she thought about what it had cost her to be cautious and self-protective, and what it had and hadn't protected her from. "I'm going to tell them myself," she said. Mabel stared at her. "I beg your pardon? If Brandt is going to use my past, I'll present it, my own version, in my own words, in my own order." She looked at Mabel. "He's arranged the facts to look like something they aren't. The only way to rearrange them is to do it publicly, before he can do it first in that room." Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, something careful in her voice, "There will be a lot of people there, Clara. I know. People who don't know you. I know. And people who will. Some of them will believe what he's been saying. You can't control that." "No," Clara said. "I can't." She picked up her coffee cup again. "But I can control whether I let him tell my story or I tell it myself. And I'm not letting him tell it." Mabel sat with that. Her expression had been changing throughout the conversation, going through stages: concern, uncertainty, and now something else. Something that looked, cautiously, like respect. "I'll be there," Mabel said. "In that room. You should know that." "Thank you, Mabel." Mabel stood to go. She paused at the kitchen door. "For what it's worth," she said, "I asked around about that estate matter, the one Brandt is referring to, the accounting discrepancy." She met Clara's eyes. "The solicitor cleared your name completely, filed a formal statement." "Yes," Clara said. "He did." "Brandt knows that," Mabel said quietly. "Yes," Clara said. "He does." Mabel left. Clara sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the sound of the buggy had faded, and then she got up and started making dinner, because the children would be hungry, and dinner still needed to be made regardless of what was coming tomorrow. Nathan came in from the field at dusk. He looked at her face and stopped. What happened? She told him. She told him all of it. Brandt's campaign, what he'd been saying, the estate matter, the solicitor's clearance, all of it. She told him standing at the stove, not looking at him, because it was easier to tell difficult truths when you were doing something with your hands. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Clara, Nathan said, I know what you're going to say. I don't think you do. She turned. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen, and his face had the look of a man who had gone through anger and out the other side into something colder and more resolved. He's doing this because he's losing, Nathan said. The water rights claim is falling apart, and he knows it. So he's coming after you because he thinks you're the weak point. He paused. He doesn't know you. She looked at him. Nathan, I need you to hear something. Tomorrow, if I stand up in that room and tell people about the estate and the solicitor's clearance, they may still not believe me. Some of them won't. And if that happens, she stopped. If that happens, it reflects on you, on the ranch. I need you to be prepared for that. I'm prepared. I need you to really be prepared, not just, Clara. He crossed the kitchen. He stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly to hold his gaze. I opened that gate for you. Do you understand what I mean by that? After 3 people left. After Margaret. After everything, I opened it. His voice was level, but it had weight behind it. I'm not closing it now because Douglas Brandt decided to lie about who you are. She felt something in her chest do something she didn't entirely want to examine in the middle of a kitchen conversation. All right, she said. All right, he said. He stepped back. He went to the sink to wash his hands. The ordinary, the immediate, the practical. That was how Nathan Carter handled moments that were bigger than the room. Clara turned back to the stove. The tomatoes are going to be ready in about 3 weeks, she said. I know. James checks them twice a day now. He does. A pause. The sound of water running, hands being washed. He told me yesterday he wants to expand the garden, Nathan said. He has a whole plan. He drew it, took up 2 pages. Clara smiled at the stove where he couldn't see it. He showed me. It's ambitious. It's enormous. He wants to grow corn. Corn is hard in this climate. That's what I told him. What did he say? He said Clara said things can come back if you don't give up on them too early. Clara stood very still for one moment. Then she stirred the pot and said nothing, because some things didn't need a response. They just needed to be felt. The Harwick Community Hall held about 60 people at capacity, and on the night of the quarterly meeting, it held close to 75, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how thoroughly Brandt had worked the valley. People had come who didn't usually come to these meetings. People had come specifically to see what was going to happen. She and Nathan arrived with Hal and Roy, and Mabel Drury was already inside and had saved them seats in the second row, which was a statement, Clara understood, about whose side Mabel had decided she was on. Douglas Brandt was at the front of the room, talking to 2 other men, and when he saw Nathan come in, his expression did a precise, controlled thing, a suppression of satisfaction, the adjustment of a man who thinks he's already won and is managing not to show it prematurely. He didn't look at Clara at all when they walked in, which told her that he had decided she wasn't worth looking at, which told her in turn that he was more rattled than he appeared. The meeting followed its usual order for the first portion: water table reports, road maintenance, a dispute about a fence line between 2 families at the north end of the valley that had been ongoing for 4 years. Clara sat and listened and watched the room and took inventory of faces. She counted 14 families she didn't recognize, and 11 she did, in various degrees from the week she'd been at Cedar Hollow. She noted which ones made eye contact with her and which ones looked away. Brandt raised the water rights matter himself, which she had expected. He was smooth about it, framing it as a concern for the valley's water management, a need for clarity on long-standing boundary questions. He referenced his survey. He used words like community resource and shared responsibility and said nothing that was technically dishonest, which made it more insidious than a lie would have been. Nathan stood up. He presented the original survey, crew's statement, the documented diversion. He did it the way Clara had spent 11 days coaching him, clearly, factually, in order, without raising his voice. He let the documents be the argument. Clara watched the room as he spoke. She watched people's faces change as the sequence became clear. The channel, the diversion, the date, the men sent to say it was hopeless. She watched the moment when it landed for a rancher near the back, an older man named Garvey, whose water had also been struggling, and she watched his face go through something private and significant. Brant responded. He acknowledged the survey, hard to dispute crew, but redirected to the estate matter. He did it with the precision of someone who had practiced the angle. He said he wasn't raising it as an accusation, simply as a question of credibility, simply as something the community deserved to consider when evaluating the individuals involved in presenting these documents. He still didn't say Clara's name directly. He said the woman Nathan Carter brought in, which was its own kind of deliberate. Clara stood up. She didn't ask for the floor. She didn't wait to be recognized. She simply stood up, and the room went quiet with the particular attention that comes when someone does something unexpected but not disruptive. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. "I'm going to tell you exactly what Mr. Brand is referring to, since he's chosen not to say it clearly himself." She told them. She told them about the employer, the death, the estate, the dispute that had been raised by the son, not by any outside party, but by the son, who had been looking for a reason to reduce the settlement owed to staff. She told them the solicitor had investigated and filed a formal clearance. She told them she had carried that clearance document in her suitcase for 3 years because she had learned that a person's past could be used against them by anyone with motive and access to partial facts. She told them she'd been turned away from 4 towns. She told them she'd walked 11 days to Cedar Hollow with 1 suitcase and a broken boot. She told them what she'd found there, a ranch being strangled by a deliberately blocked water channel, children who had been through too much loss, and a man who had been working himself to the bone for 2 years without understanding why things kept getting worse. "I'm not asking you to trust me because I'm telling you to," she said. "I'm asking you to look at the documents that are on that table and apply the same intelligence you'd apply to anything else. The original survey is clear. Aldous Crew's statement is signed and sealed. The channel is running. The lower pasture at Cedar Hollow is recovering." She let that sit for a moment. "And Douglas Brant commissioned a new survey after we found the diversion. Not before, after. Ask yourself why the timing works out that way." The room was very quiet. She sat down. Her hands, in her lap, were steadier than she'd expected. Nathan was looking at her from the chair beside her. She didn't look at him. She watched the room. Garvey, the older rancher near the back, raised his hand. "I'd like to see that original survey," he said. "And the crew statement. Would you pass those around?" Nathan passed them around. They went around the room, hand to hand, and Clara watched each set of hands that held them, and she watched each face above those hands, and she cataloged what she saw. Recognition. Recalculation. The slow shift of a room that has been told a story and is discovering there is another story underneath it. Brant tried twice more. Once with a procedural argument about the county filing, once with an implication about the appropriateness of a woman in Nathan's household. The second one landed wrong with the room. You could feel it, the slight recoil, the sense that he'd misjudged what would land. Mabel Drury said something sharp from her seat that Clara didn't fully catch but didn't need to, because the effect was visible. 2 women near the front sat up straighter, and a man named Tolliver, who had sat on the fence all evening, turned to look at Brant with an expression that had moved from neutral to skeptical. It wasn't over in that room. Nothing like this is ever fully resolved in one meeting, and Clara knew that. Some people would leave that hall still uncertain. Some would go home and sit with what they'd heard for days before they decided what they thought. And Brant had enough money and enough influence to make the next months difficult, regardless of what had happened tonight. But the room had changed. She could feel the exact moment it changed, not in any single speech or document or look, but in the accumulated weight of evidence and presence and the specific unrepeatable quality of a person standing up in a room and telling the truth about themselves before someone else could twist it. The moment when the room stopped being a room that Brant was narrating and became a room that was making up its own mind. When the meeting broke up and people were moving toward the door, Garvey stopped beside Nathan and put out his hand. "I've been watching my East Creek run low for 2 seasons, he said. "I want to look at my surveys." 3 other ranchers had the same conversation with Nathan before they reached the door. Outside in the cold air, Clara stood beside Hal while Nathan finished talking and pulled her coat close and looked up at the sky, which was clear and enormous and full of stars the way Wyoming sky is when there's no cloud and the air is dry. Roy appeared beside her. He looked out at the same sky. "That was something," he said. "What you did in there. It needed doing." "A lot of things need doing. Not many people do them." He was quiet a moment. "I wrote down what I remembered about those two men. Dates, names, like you said." He reached into his coat and held out a folded piece of paper. "In case it's useful." Clara took it. "Thank you, Roy." He nodded. He went to get the horses. Nathan came out of the hall and found her. He stood beside her and looked up at the same sky and didn't say anything for a moment. There was a specific quality to standing beside someone in silence when the silence is shared rather than separate, and Clara felt it, felt the difference between this and the careful distances of the first weeks. "Garvey wants to look at his surveys," Nathan said. "I heard. There might be others with the same problem." "There might." He was quiet again, then, "Clara, when you stood up in there, I know. I was going to do it. I was trying to figure out how, and you just—" "It was my story," she said simply. "It made more sense for me to tell it." He looked at her. The light from the hall windows reached them just enough to see his face. "You didn't have to do any of this," he said. "The maps, Casper, tonight, none of this was part of the arrangement." "No," she said. "It wasn't." "Why did you?" It was the same question he'd asked before, a different night, and she had a different answer now, or perhaps the same answer with more of the truth in it. "Because it mattered," she said. "This place, the children, the water in that channel." She looked out at the dark. "Because I've spent a long time being somewhere I was tolerated. And here, for the first time in a long time, I felt—" She stopped. Found the word. "Necessary." Nathan was very quiet. "You are," he said. "You are necessary." He said it plainly, without embellishment, and it landed exactly as plainly, and Clara felt it go somewhere deep and settle there. She didn't say anything. The stars were very bright, and the air was very cold, and across the yard she could hear Roy and Hal talking by the horses, and somewhere inside the hall a lamp was being blown out. She stood there beside Nathan Carter in the dark outside the Harwick Hall, and the lower pasture at Cedar Hollow was getting greener by the day, and the documents were solid and real, and there was still work to be done. There would always be work to be done. But for right now, in this cold, clear Wyoming night, she let herself simply stand somewhere she had not been turned away from. That was not a small thing. After 11 days and 4 towns and 1 broken boot, that was not a small thing at all. Brant didn't fold quietly. Clara hadn't expected him to. In the 2 weeks following the Harwick meeting, he made 3 more moves, each one a little less confident than the last, the way a man fights when he knows the ground is shifting but hasn't accepted it yet. He filed a supplementary claim with the county office, challenging the validity of Crew's statement on the grounds that Crew was too elderly to be considered a reliable witness. He sent Whitfield back to Cedar Hollow with a revised offer. Higher this time, considerably higher, which told Clara more about how the water rights situation looked from Brant's side than anything else could have. And he put pressure on 2 of the smaller ranchers in the valley, men who owed him money, to sign affidavits questioning the timeline of the channel restoration. Nathan's attorney in Casper handled the county filing. He wrote a response that was, by the attorney's own description, blunt, and it addressed the attempt to discredit Crew with the specific contempt it deserved, pointing out that Aldous Crew had surveyed over 200 properties in the county over 4 decades, and that his professional record contained no disputes, and that the attempt to dismiss his testimony on the basis of age was not a legal argument but an insult dressed as one. The revised offer from Whitfield, Nathan turned down in under a minute. He didn't consult Clara about it. He didn't need to. He looked at Whitfield across the kitchen table and said, "Tell your client the answer is no, and will continue to be no." And Whitfield picked up his satchel and left, and Nathan stood at the kitchen window watching the buggy go with an expression Clara had not seen on him before. Not anger, not relief, but something that looked like a man recognizing his own reflection after a long time of not looking. The affidavits were the most difficult problem because they involved people rather than paperwork. and people were harder to resolve than documents. The two ranchers, a man named Sutter and a man named Dees, had signed statements that were carefully worded to imply the timeline of the channel restoration was suspicious without saying so directly. Clara read both statements and felt the familiar pattern of it. Not lies, but truth arranged to mislead, which was Brant's particular skill, and the thing about him that was harder to fight than outright dishonesty. She went to see Sutter herself. She rode out on a Tuesday morning without telling Nathan, because she knew he would want to come, and she needed this conversation to happen between two people, not three. Sutter's ranch was smaller than Cedar Hollow, scraping by in the way that small operations in this part of Wyoming scraped by. Enough to survive a good year, not enough to absorb a bad one. His wife answered the door, a thin woman with a careful face, and showed Clara in without enthusiasm. Sutter was a weathered man in his 50s who had the look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that he'd forgotten what standing straight felt like. He sat across from Clara at his kitchen table and didn't look at her directly. "I know why you're here," he said. "I figured you might." "Brant holds my note," he said. "The loan on the East grazing land. I've been paying it down, but if he calls it early—" He stopped. "I have a family." "I know. I'm not a bad man." He said it with the particular desperation of someone who needs to be told they're not what their actions suggest. "I know that too," Clara said. "But Sutter, those affidavits are going to be used to take water from a man who is raising 2 children alone. Water that was stolen from him 9 years ago while his wife was dying." She said it plainly, not cruelly. "That's what they're going to be used for. I want you to know that clearly." Sutter looked at his hands. "If Brant wins this," Clara continued, "it doesn't protect you. It just tells him that the affidavit method works. You'll be useful to him again next time he needs it." She paused. "And if he loses, when he loses, you'll have signed your name to something you can't take back." The kitchen was quiet. His wife was somewhere in the back of the house. A clock on the wall measured the silence. "What can I do about the note?" he said. "If I cross him, talk to Nathan's attorney in Casper. There are legal limits on what a creditor can do with a note when the loan is being serviced. Brant may be counting on you not knowing what those limits are." She looked at him steadily. "You have more ground to stand on than he's let you believe. That's how he operates." Sutter looked up at her. He had the eyes of a man who wanted to believe he had options and wasn't sure he was allowed to. "I'll think about it," he said. "Think fast," Clara said. "We're running out of time on the county filing." She rode back to Cedar Hollow and told Nathan what she'd done. He was quiet for a moment. "You went alone," he said. "I did. I would have come." "I know. That's why I went alone." Sutter needed to feel like he was making a choice, not being cornered by 2 people. She unsaddled Hal's horse, her regular mount now, by unspoken agreement, and hung the saddle over the rail. He might retract the affidavit. He might not. But he's thinking about it, which is more than he was doing before. Nathan looked at her. He had a new habit, in these weeks, of looking at her a certain way. Not the wariness of the early days, not the careful neutrality of the second and third week. Something more direct than either of those, something that stayed on her face a moment longer than strictly necessary. "You know," he said, "when I opened that gate, I thought I was doing you a favor." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm aware," he said, "of how that sounds now." She almost laughed. It was close. The closest thing to a genuine laugh she'd produced in longer than she could track. She caught it before it fully formed, pressed her lips together, and led Hal's horse toward the water trough. "Yes," she said, over her shoulder. "You should be." Sutter retracted his affidavit 4 days later. Dees held, which Clara had halfway expected. Dees had a larger debt and a shorter history of independent thinking, but one retraction was enough to change the complexion of Brant's supplementary claim at the county office, and Nathan's attorney used it with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to apply pressure. The county ruling came on a gray Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the Harwick meeting. Nathan came in from the yard holding the document and handed it to Clara without saying anything. She read it standing at the kitchen counter, still in her coat, the door not yet fully shut behind her. The water rights claim was dismissed. The original survey stood as the governing document. The spring head was confirmed as Carter property. The county assessor had added a notation, unusual, in Claire's experience, for a county ruling to include an editorial comment, but this assessor apparently felt strongly, observing that the diversion of a registered water channel without the property owner's knowledge or consent was a matter that warranted further examination by the appropriate authorities. That last sentence was important. Clara read it twice. "Nathan," she said, "I saw it." The assessor is opening the door to a fraud investigation. This doesn't just end Brandt's claim. It starts something else. "I know." She looked up from the document. He was watching her read it with an expression she'd seen him practice over the past weeks without ever quite finishing. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "A fraud investigation is long. It's costly, even if you're not the one paying the legal fees. It keeps this alive." Nathan thought about it. He was better at thinking before he spoke than when she'd arrived. She'd noticed that, the gradual return of a man who trusted his own process. "Brandt took 2 years of water and tried to take the land and tried to take your reputation," he said. "He used people who owed him money as weapons, and he sent men onto my property to lie to me while I was burying my wife." He folded the document carefully. "Yes, that's what I want." She nodded. "Then I'll write to the attorney this afternoon." "Clara," he caught her eye. "Write it together with me. I need to understand every part of this, not just the outcome." She looked at him. That was new too. Not the asking, but the specific nature of what he was asking. Not you handle it, but show me how it works. The difference between those two things was the difference between a man who needed help and a man who was rebuilding himself. "After dinner," she said. "We'll do it after dinner." What happened over the following months was not a single dramatic resolution, but a series of smaller ones that accumulated into something permanent, which was how real change usually worked, in Clara's experience. Not a door thrown open, but a series of windows, one by one, letting in more light. The county began its review of the diversion. Brandt's attorney responded, as attorneys do, with delays and filings and procedural objections, but the review moved forward. 2 of the ranchers who had been at the Harwick meeting, Garvey first, then a man named Aldridge, found irregularities in their own water surveys and brought them to Nathan, who brought them to his attorney, who began to see a pattern that was larger than Cedar Hollow and more interesting to a county assessor than a single property dispute. Roy, who had written down everything he remembered about the 2 men and their visit, gave his statement to the attorney. He came to Nathan first and told him what he was going to do, and Nathan listened and then shook his hand, and Roy looked like a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying too long. The lower pasture recovered. Not overnight, not in a single season. The first rains after the channel was clear did most of the initial work, and then the second season brought the grass back in earnest. And by late the following summer, the lower pasture looked the way old Hal said he remembered it looking when he'd first come to work at Cedar Hollow 12 years ago, green and solid and quietly productive. The tomatoes were enormous. James had expanded the kitchen garden in stages, proposing each addition to Clara with the same 2-page diagram he'd drawn up for the original plan, revised and re-revised in his small, careful handwriting. He didn't get the corn to work the first year. Clara had been right about the climate, but he didn't give up on it. He researched it in the limited way a 7-year-old can research anything, by asking every adult he encountered what they knew about growing corn in cold ground and recording their answers in a notebook that Clara had found for him in the bottom of her suitcase, an unused one she'd carried for years against the possibility of needing it for accounts. He filled it. Lily was a different kind of transformation. Quieter, more internal, which suited her nature. She had always been the child who absorbed things before she showed them, and what she absorbed over those months was specific and practical. How to bake bread that rose properly, how to manage the kitchen accounts, how to hem a skirt on a straight line and mend a split seam so it didn't show. She stopped setting 4 plates at dinner sometime in the late spring. Clara noticed the first time she didn't and didn't say anything, and felt the significance of it settle quietly. Lily noticed that Clara noticed. That was the thing about Lily. She noticed noticing. She was, Clara thought, going to be formidable when she grew up. Quietly, absolutely formidable. One afternoon in early summer, Lily sat down across from Clara while Clara was working on the household accounts and said, without preamble, "Do you think about leaving?" Clara set down her pen. "What makes you ask that?" You came here because you had nowhere else to go, Lily said. It was a statement of fact, not an accusation. But now things are better. You could go somewhere else. I could, Clara said. Do you want to? Clara looked at the accounts on the table. She looked at the kitchen, with its mended chair and its worn broom that had been replaced twice since she'd arrived, and its window over the sink that let in the afternoon light at exactly the angle that made the whole room look warmer than it was. She looked at Lily, who was watching her with those careful, honest eyes that missed very little. No, Clara said. I don't want to. Lily looked at her for a moment, taking the measure of that answer. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and reached across the table and picked up the pen Clara had set down and began working on her own handwriting practice. She'd asked Clara to teach her to write figures for accounts, and they'd been practicing for weeks. They sat together at the kitchen table in the afternoon light and didn't say anything else, and Clara felt the particular quiet of a place where you belong, which is different from other kinds of quiet. Nathan asked her to stay on an evening in late summer, a Sunday, when the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet in the way that only Sunday evenings manage in working places, a rest that is real, not just a pause between tasks. He didn't make a speech about it. That would not have been Nathan. He said he'd been trying to figure out how to say it for a few weeks, and had decided that the direct way was probably the only way that would come out right. I want you to stay, he said. Not because the ranch needs you, though it does. Not because the children need you, though they do. He looked at his hands on the table, then back up at her. I need you. I didn't think I would need anyone again. I thought that part of things was over for me. He said it without self-pity, just as an honest account of where he'd been. I was wrong about that. Clara held his gaze. She had known this was coming. She was not a woman who missed the direction things were moving, and she had thought about what she would say when it arrived, and she had one question, the question that mattered more than any other. Nathan, she said, can you love someone new while still keeping her, Margaret? Not putting her away, not pretending that part didn't happen, just both things true at once. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table, and she let him take his time because this was not a question to rush. I think about her every day, he said. I'm going to think about her every day for the rest of my life. I'm not going to apologize for that, and I'm not going to pretend it's less than it is. He looked up. But I've learned something this past year. I learned it watching you, that loving something doesn't mean you close everything else out. It means you love it well for what it was, and you don't let it become a wall. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers, carefully, the way he did things, with deliberate intention. She was my wife, he said. You are something I don't have a word for yet, but I know what it feels like, and I know I don't want to lose it. Clara looked at his hand over hers. She thought about 11 days of walking. She thought about 4 towns that had turned her away. She thought about the word diverted written in pencil in a margin, and the boot on the porch step, and James coming out of his room, and the look on Aldous Crew's face when he reached for his old surveyor's seal. She thought about the fact that strength had carried her here, but strength alone wouldn't have been enough. She had needed somewhere to be strong, somewhere that had room for it. Yes, she said, I'll stay. He didn't move immediately. He sat with it, with what she'd said, the way he sat with things that mattered, feeling the full weight of them before moving forward. Then he turned his hand over under hers and held it properly. They were not people who moved fast, either of them. They had both been broken carefully by life and had healed in ways that left them cautious, which was not a flaw but a kind of honesty. What came after was slow and real and occasionally difficult and full of the ordinary friction of 2 people who had both survived enough to have strong opinions about things. But it was theirs. Brandt's fraud investigation concluded the following spring. The outcome was not a dramatic public reckoning. Clara had stopped expecting dramatic public reckonings for men like Brandt, who had enough money and legal insulation to soften most impacts. What it was formal and documented. A finding of deliberate interference with a registered water channel, a financial penalty substantial enough to matter, a required restoration of any water resources affected by the diversion across the valley, and a county record that followed his name into every future transaction. He did not lose everything. Men like Brant rarely did. But he lost the thing he'd been building toward, the quiet accumulation of valley water rights, the plan that required Cedar Hollow to fail. That plan was finished, documented, and a matter of county record, which meant he couldn't try again without everyone knowing what he was trying. That was enough. It was what was available, and Clara had learned long ago that fighting for what was available and real was more useful than fighting for a version of justice that only existed in theory. Garvey's water was restored. Aldridge's channel was found to have been similarly tampered with 5 years before, a fact that had been obscured by 2 years of dry seasons that made the reduced flow seem natural. When that became clear, Aldridge came to Cedar Hollow and sat with Nathan at the kitchen table for 2 hours, and they talked in the way that men talk when they've both been through something that recalibrates things. Clara brought them coffee and left them to it. The cooperative that formed from those conversations was not formalized quickly. Nothing in a ranching valley formalizes quickly, but it grew into something real, a shared understanding about water management, about survey documentation, about what it meant to look out for one another's resources in a landscape that could be hard on everyone and that certain people were willing to make harder. Garvey became its most vocal advocate. Roy, who had spent 7 years being a ranch hand and had quietly become something more, helped manage the survey coordination between properties. Mabel Drury, for her part, became what she had been gesturing toward since the clothesline conversation months before. Not quite a friend of Clara's, because they were too different for friendship to be easy, but something more durable than that. An ally with clear eyes and a willingness to say out loud what other people were only thinking. Clara respected that more than easy friendship, which she'd always found unreliable anyway. Lily turned 10 in August, and James turned 8 in October, and Lily spent the weeks before her birthday lobbying for a specific kind of cake, a tall one, with lemon, which she had found in a recipe that Clara had written out for her in the winter, and which she wanted to make entirely herself. Clara supervised without interfering, which meant standing in the kitchen and visibly not reaching over to fix things that Lily needed to fix herself. The cake listed slightly to one side. It tasted perfect. James planted his corn in the spring of the following year. He had spent the winter in correspondence with a farmer 2 counties east who had worked out a method for cold climate corn that involved specific mounding and particular timing. The farmer had written back with detailed instructions, and James had followed them with the religious attention of a child who has never been told that something can't be done by someone who knew what they were talking about. The corn grew, not abundantly. The climate was still the climate, but it grew, green and improbable and absolutely present in the corner of the kitchen garden where everyone had said it wouldn't work. James stood in front of it one morning and looked at it with the expression of a person who has been proven right about something that mattered to them. Clara stood beside him and felt the echo of something she'd said to him 2 years ago in a different season. Things can come back if you don't give up on them too early. It worked, he said. It did. He looked up at her. You didn't think it would. I thought the climate was against it. I was wrong about what that meant. She looked at the corn. Being wrong is worth more than being right if you learn more from it. James considered this. Roy says you're never wrong. Roy is being generous. He said it like it was a complaint, James said. Clara almost smiled. That's fair too. The day Clara finally replaced her boots was a Wednesday in late autumn of the second year, and it was not dramatic in any way. She had been making do with the left boot for longer than she should have, had resoled it twice, had kept the back seam together with careful stitching that needed redoing every few months. And Nathan noticed one morning that she was walking with a slight lean to compensate for the way the heel had worn. He brought her new boots without announcing it, set them on the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, plain brown leather, good quality, her size. He'd measured her old pair while she was in the kitchen garden. She stood in the kitchen and looked at them. Nathan, she said. Before you say anything, he said, they're practical. It's winter. You need boots that work. I know they're practical. So don't... He stopped, not sure what he was telling her not to do. She picked up one of the boots. She turned it over in her hands. Good leather, solid sole, stitching that would last. Boots made for a person who was going to be somewhere for a long time and needed what they wore to hold up accordingly. She sat down and put them on. They fit. Of course they fit. He had measured. She stood up and walked across the kitchen floor and felt the even, solid purchase of boots that weren't compensating for anything, weren't being held together by careful maintenance and willpower, weren't the artifact of a journey she was still somehow midway through. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the lower pasture, which was green and solid and would be ready for the winter grass before the first hard frost, and at the kitchen garden where James's corn had been harvested and the beds had been turned for the spring, and at the upper slope where the channel ran without obstruction, carrying water down to ground that had been starved of it for nearly a decade. She thought about the woman who had stood at the iron gate 2 years ago with a broken boot and a suitcase held shut by thumb pressure, and the specific determination of someone who had run out of options and decided that running out of options was not the same as being finished. That woman had been her. She was still her. The difficult parts of the journey didn't disappear because the destination had turned out to be real. They just became the story of how you got there, which was different from being the whole story. She thought about what she had understood, slowly and incompletely, over 2 years at Cedar Hollow. That worth was not something other people confirmed by opening their doors. It was something you carried through the door with you, or didn't. That belonging was not a gift someone gave you, but a thing built from the inside out, in the making of bread, and the finding of water, and the keeping of promises made to 8-year-old girls about coming back. That strength was not always loud. Sometimes it was just the refusal, repeated daily, to accept that something broken was beyond repair. And she had learned something about grief, too, which she had not expected. She had come to Cedar Hollow thinking grief was Nathan's problem, the thing that was making this ranch fail, the obstacle between this man and his life. What she had found instead was that grief was everyone's problem. Hers, too, quietly, the grief of a person who had spent years being useful to others and had never quite let herself be somewhere permanent enough to lose something. Grief required that you had been somewhere long enough to feel the absence when it changed. She had avoided that so thoroughly that she'd stopped noticing she was avoiding it. Cedar Hollow had cured her of the avoidance, not gently, not all at once, but in the way that real places do, by requiring her presence, day after day, in a way that didn't let her stay at the surface of things. Nathan came to stand beside her at the window. He did that, stood beside her, and looked at the same thing she was looking at, which was how they most naturally talked about things that mattered, looking at the shared thing rather than at each other. "Good fit?" he asked, about the boots. "Perfect fit." He nodded. He looked out at the lower pasture. "Hal says if this winter's mild, we could expand the herd in spring. The pasture will support it." "Roy agrees," Claire said. "He told me last week. You two are getting along better. We understand each other now." Nathan was quiet a moment. "I've been thinking about the north fence. It needs to be moved back. The land we fenced off is usable now that the water's reliable. There's probably 20 more acres we've been leaving idle. James will want to put half of it in crops. James will want all of it in crops. We should let him try." Nathan looked at her. "You know that's going to mean an argument with every ranch hand we have about whether corn belongs on a cattle property." "James will win the argument," Claire said. "He has data." Nathan was quiet for a moment, and then he did something she had come to know over 2 years and still valued every time. He laughed. Not a performance of it, not a polite acknowledgement of something funny. A real one, short and genuine, from somewhere that had been closed for a long time before she arrived and had opened slowly, the way things do when the pressure changes. She turned and looked at him when he did it, because she still liked to. He caught her looking and didn't look away. That was the thing about Nathan Carter. He'd been cautious about everything, at the beginning, every door, every person, every possibility of being let down again. But once he decided clearly, and he didn't hedge what he'd decided or leave exits open just in case. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just looking." He put his arm around her shoulders, the way he did sometimes, comfortable and undemonstrative and solid. "At what?" She looked back out the window. At the lower pasture, green in the gray autumn light. At the upper slope where water ran unseen through the cleared channel. At the kitchen garden with its turned beds and the small wooden stake James had left marking where the corn would go again in the spring. "At what's here," she said. "I'm looking at what's here." He nodded, and they stood there in the kitchen with the winter coming and the boots solid on her feet and the ranch around them doing what ranches do when they're properly looked after. Not perfectly, not without effort, not without the inevitable losses that any honest life accumulates, but steadily and with enough good years ahead to make the work feel like more than maintenance. Clara Whitmore had walked through a gate one cold Wyoming morning with a broken boot and a suitcase and the conviction that she was not finished, even if the evidence suggested otherwise. She had found, behind that iron gate, a man who was not finished either, and two children who had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone who would stay. She had not saved Cedar Hollow Ranch. She had given it back its water, and its evidence, and its voice, in a room full of people who had almost decided its story for it. The ranch had done the rest, the way land does when it's given what it needs. Quietly, seasonally, without fanfare. Just growth returning to ground that had never stopped being worth growing in. And the woman who had been turned away from 4 towns, who had been told in 100 different ways that she was not enough for the places she was trying to get to. That woman had found, finally, that the place she was enough for was not a lesser place. It was not a consolation prize or a settlement. It was a place that needed exactly the kind of person she was, and had needed her specifically, and had not known it until she walked through the gate. She hadn't found a place that saved her. She had found a place where the things she was capable of finally had room. That was not a small thing. After everything, after 11 days and 4 towns and 1 broken boot and 1 buried timber dam and 1 long, cold ride to find an old man with a surveyor's seal, that was not a small thing at all. Cedar Hollow Ranch stood through the winter and the spring after, and the years that followed, and the water ran, and the fields grew, and the children grew, and the story of the woman who found the hidden water became one of those valley stories that gets told at meetings and at fences and over shared meals until the specific facts blur into something more like weather, just a true thing, part of the landscape, not remarkable anymore because it had become simply the way things were, which was, in the end, the best possible version of a thing worth fighting for.